ceistile sin iver Nika 3 I heachta Paul McCauley.
Las Concorda. Minister, I wonder if you would give consideration to those people who are in a domestic abuse situation, who often find, through happen, other forms of temporary housing, find refuge away from what is the family home, but might previously be on a local authority waiting list in their area, to allow them to transfer to a local authority waiting list in another area, but not to lose the time that they would have built up. It's a very unique circumstances, which I think gives some room for consideration in the matter.
Before I answer that, Las Concorda, I just think for the clarity's sake for the House, there's just a cursory glance in relation to Croí Cónaithe. And this is important that members, when they come in here, that they state what their correct position is. Last year's alternative budget, and I'm quoting from Sinn Féin, as part of the financing of this component of our public housing policy, Sinn Féin would redirect the amount of funding in the Croí Cónaithe Towns Fund into the capital funding of the local authorities. No, take away Sinn, but it's important people know that. So you can't. So you know that. So you know that. Now, in relation to this very. In relation to this very important matter, applications for social housing support, as you know, are assessed by each individual local authority, and that's governed by the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2009. Generally, it's not possible for a household previously on one social housing waiting list to carry the time spent on the list when applying to another local authority. A new and separate application form would be required and assessed against the eligibility, including income limits and the criteria that you know. If deemed eligible, the applicant's household will qualify for a suite of supports, including HAP, as you've mentioned. Local authorities will prioritise allocations to those households they consider to be most in need, and that can include survivors of domestic violence. And notwithstanding this, the programme for government does provide for a package of social housing reforms. I'll come back in on the supplementary, but this is an area that we're actively looking at. And I think where we should look at it is around that discretion in each local authority area, particularly for survivors of domestic gender-based and sexual violence. And the housing passport is something that is being looked at too. There are complexities around that, around how that would be administered. But I think in particular the need for many survivors to leave where they are for their own safety. And all of us, I'm sure, have dealt with cases like this. And so I'm glad you've raised it. We're watching it very, I think the area of discretion that we can point to in each local authority area and priorities that we will look at. I'll come back in on the supplementary.
Yeah, Minister, I welcome you being open to the issue. Look, actually, I dealt recently with a tenant in situ case where a tenant who was a victim of domestic violence in HAP was losing their home, and the local authority did include them in the tenant in situ scheme. It was a bit convoluted getting there, but they walked away from a property interest they had in a family home. And anybody else would be saying, well, why would you walk away from a property interest? And it was because she was so damaged by the experience, but so broken by what had happened, that she just couldn't go back to that home. She couldn't in any way go back to that relationship. She didn't want to give that person control over her life. So I think in those very limited circumstances, we should be providing discretion at the local authority level. I hadn't considered that, but actually I would have great confidence with the local authority staff that they would do that. I do agree that we have to be careful, and representing a Dublin constituency, I don't want everybody in the country to be able to switch up to Dublin, and people who are on the list for many, many years being pushed up and down the list. But I would ask in these very limited circumstances that something be done in order to address the issue.
Yeah, there are areas where, as you know, local authorities can provide priority, and the schedule of allocations is governed by the local authorities. I would ask them, and I have seen it happen, where you have a survivor of domestic violence needs to leave, where the local authorities are very supportive, even in instances whereby, let's say, someone had or has an interest in a family home but have to leave it. We're making progress on this, and I just want to briefly fill you in. We've changed how we're funding domestic violence refuges as well. The Capital Assistance Scheme, which provided 100% of the funding for accommodation, will now also advance 100% of funding for ancillary services related to residence and counselling rooms. There's a lot of work my own department and our department are doing to support justice and other agencies as well around, particularly looking at the areas of the country where there are no refuges now, to prioritise those areas. Indeed, I was in Wexford recently where the new refuge is being built there too. But I will, following your intervention, we will discuss this with local authorities further and revert.
I have to Paul McConnell.
Sir, I know many years ago when local authorities had a smaller number of approved housing bodies providing housing and they had more discretion to take it outside the scheme of lettings, often those AHB developments were used for these kind of more sensitive cases where discretion could be applied. We're in a much changed landscape than we were 10 years ago when local authorities had that power. But discretion with housing officers have a greater understanding of the housing crisis than perhaps anybody even here in this House. And therefore, they're also able to understand the uniqueness of a case like this for where there is domestic violence, if within parameters and with necessary controls in place, something could be put in at a local authority level, because you could be maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years on a waiting list. Somebody could be subjected to this domestic violence from a relationship that was developed midway through that process, and for them to lose all of that time and then to find themselves starting all over again in a new area, it's hard enough, but then to disadvantage them in terms of securing housing, and we know that they can build a new life for themselves with a home, and anything we can do, I think, Minister, will be welcome.
Before the Minister comes in, there are 2 more contributors. I shall to Owen O'Brien.
Deputy McCullough for raising this. This is a hugely important matter which many of us have raised for quite a number of years. The social housing passport is the solution to this issue. It has been promised for a decade. Alan Kelly had it in his Social Housing 2020 plan published in 2014. Simon Coveney had it in his Rebuilding Ireland 2016. It is in the current government's housing plan. I don't accept that it's complicated. I think government has to decide what criteria should apply. Domestic violence is clearly one, but there are a number of others, like, for example, employment, education and medical needs. If the Minister was to bring forward such legislation, I think he would have the universal support of the House. Social passport, housing passport is the answer. It's a decade in the waiting. We'll support you if you introduce it, and we'd urge you to do that as soon as you can.
Dr. Cian O'Callaghan.
To thank Deputy McAuliffe for raising this very important issue. And just on that, if the Minister can give us an update in terms of social housing passport, because I would be concerned that discretion just won't be enough to actually get what we're all looking for here. And then just to raise the issue of, it can be particularly frustrating for people who've suffered domestic violence to have delays in HAP applications. And I know that's an issue across the board, but particularly in relation to people who suffer domestic violence, that needs to be given extra priority. So if you can comment on that.
Minister.
Look, thank all deputies for their contributions here. We actually, the 3 ministers here, we discussed this yesterday at some length, and I was on foot of your question, but I've engaged with Minister McEntee as well in relation to the new national strategy and what we can do there to help. You know, Minister Humphreys has made changes on the social welfare side. Cian, in relation to that HAP issue, that's certainly something we can reiterate. What I find, and I've dealt with individual cases myself, is that you'll have usually have a case officer, and they're usually processed very quickly, actually, when it's understood what the situation is. Someone needs to access other properties. So if we can reiterate that. Just to Deputy O'Brien, we have done the scoping exercise on the passport. It is a commitment in the programme for government. I think there are genuine issues on an administrative basis, okay, because you'd have to track the movement of people across the board. So I think it's understood that it is not easy. But this cohort of people who are extremely vulnerable, it's something that, following our meeting yesterday, they're going to look again specifically at, that if we could look at some particular cohorts, particularly those most vulnerable, that we could see how we could do this without having other consequences or without setting a precedent across the board. So we will look at it, and I thank the Deputy for his question here this morning.
Your cooperation will fit in 2 more questions. So I